Hey there, my name is Cameron. Welcome to Beyond the Parallax Effect. This is Lesson 1. In this video series, you will learn how to set up and add motion to this astronaut scene using the vanishing point and puppet pin techniques. So let's dive in and get started. The vanishing point technique all begins in Photoshop. Using the vanishing point filter, a 3D texture plane is extracted from a flat image. Then, in After Effects, that textured plane is used to create the 3D parallax effect. The results are quite convincing. This Inception-inspired scene is comprised of two photographs. The first photograph is of this windowed corridor, and the second photograph is of this astronaut floating in space. The first step in building out the scene is to isolate the astronaut from the space background. There are multiple ways to do this in Photoshop, but for this example, the Quick Selection tool is a good and reliable option. After the astronaut is extracted from the scene, save as a Photoshop or PNG file with Alpha Channel. Next, the windowed corridor photograph is opened. Since this photograph will be the scene environment and needs to be three-dimensional, the vanishing point effect is added to it. Go to Filter, Vanishing Point. A separate vanishing point window will appear. Vanishing point works best with photos containing geometric angles like architecture. Start by selecting the Create Plane tool and clicking on a window corner in the photograph. The window is a great place to start building the vanishing point effect because it has 4 visible corners with solid angles. Click on a second corner of the window. A grid will start to form. Repeat the process, clicking on the remaining window corners until there are 4 connected points, creating a full grid over the window. The grid color should be blue. If the grid plane is red, the grid is unusable. Individual corner points can be selected and moved until the grid plane turns blue. Expand the grid in all directions so that it completely covers this plane of the photo. While hovering over a middle point of any side of the grid plane, Command-click and drag to create a second plane. A second plane will appear and should correspond to the correct perspective of the photograph geometry. In this case, the second plane sits correctly over the wall. If the perspective does not align, hold down the Option key and rotate the plane to correctly align. Repeat this process for all 4 sides, plus the back side, essentially creating a long tunnel with a back face. Make sure that the grid edges like this overlap. This ensures that 100% of the photograph is textured on the planes. Once a working grid is set up, any perspective edits such as painting, cloning, copying or pasting, and transforming can be performed. All edits will honor the perspective of the planes. This allows for more realistic results in perspective because the edits are properly oriented and scaled to the perspective planes. Once any edits are done, it is time to export for After Effects. Click here and select Export for After Effects. Select a folder structure and save. A .vpe and all necessary image files needed for After Effects will be exported. The vanishing point file is ready to be imported into After Effects. Unfortunately, the shortcuts in After Effects for importing general file types do not work on vanishing point files. Instead, go to File, Import, Vanishing Point. Select the VPE file, but not the images. After Effects will know how to properly import the accompanying textures and how to correctly arrange them in the composition. Double-click the composition to open it in the timeline. A camera, parent null, and all the texture planes will be visible. All the elements needed to animate are here, but need adjustments before going any further. At this point, if any 3D layer is added to the scene, it would not be visible to the composition camera because the scene is not centered as 0. This is common with vanishing point files. Parent all layers to the camera and then 0 out the Z position. The scene is now recentered. Unparent the parent null from the camera and reparent the texture planes back to the parent null. Now, one other problem needs to be addressed. In vanishing point files, the After Effects camera defaults to a 2-node camera. Since the camera position has been reset to 0, moving the camera at this point will cause the view to go askew. This can be easily fixed by option clicking on the camera point of interest and creating an expression. Pick whip the camera's point of interest to the camera position. Press Enter, not Return, on the keyboard or click outside the expression text box to enable this expression. The composition is now fully set up and ready to animate. If a 1-node camera is preferred over a 2-node camera, the last step can be avoided by going into the camera settings and changing the camera mode from 2-node to 1-node. Now it is best to clean up the composition for further compositing by selecting the parent null and grid texture planes, pre-composing, and then collapsing transformations. The new hallway pre-comp is still a fully 3D composition and will react to the camera, but there are less layers to manage in the timeline. Import the astronaut Photoshop file by double-clicking in the project window, selecting the astronaut file, and clicking OK. Create a new comp with dimensions 2000 by 2000. Name it Astronaut PC for pre-comp, click OK, and drag the Photoshop file into the composition. Place the astronaut pre-comp in the working comp and scale down to an appropriate size. The scene is now ready for motion. The astronaut needs to be pushed back in Z space to give the composition some depth. Click and drag the Z position value so that the astronaut moves back in Z, somewhere around 4,000 pixels. Readjust scale as necessary. With the camera selected, set a keyframe for the Z position at frame 0. Move the time indicator to the end of the composition and reposition the camera by using the camera tool shortcut C and selecting the Track Z camera tool. Click and drag until the camera tracks in closer to the astronaut. Upon previewing, the camera movement now has a slow push in on the astronaut, and the parallax effect can finally be seen. Repeat this process and set a keyframe for the Z rotation of the camera. Give it a slight rotation while pushing in on the Z-axis. Adding the rotation to the position movement will create more interesting motion that helps to add to the surreal and anti-gravity feeling of the shot. Notice that both camera movements are very subtle. Subtle movement is key in pulling off the parallax effect. Too much movement makes a scene look fake. Too little movement and the effect cannot be seen. Secondary motion will be added to the astronaut to add more subtle movement to the scene. Go back into the astronaut pre-comp. Select the astronaut layer. Go to the tool menu and select the puppet pin tool. Essentially, the puppet pin tool is used to quickly add natural motion to layers. It's an effect that deforms parts of an image based on where the pins are placed and moved to. By clicking on the astronaut image, pins are added to the astronaut. Add a pin at each of the joints. Also add pins to parts of the body that should not move. In general, this setup works. Keyframes are automatically set when pins are added to the image. Select the keyframes and move them to the end of the timeline so that the astronaut will end his pose with no distortion. Move the time indicator to the beginning of the timeline and select a pin. One by one, reposition the pins to create movement on the astronaut. Refine the pinpoint placements until the motion looks believable. Notice that not all of the puppet pins move. The pins that were placed in positions to anchor body parts are left alone. Lastly, add the curves effect and adjust to rebalance the whites from a cool tone to a warmer tone. In the next video lesson, we will dive deeper into this scene and finish it out with compositing, particle systems, lighting, and an overall look.